Welcome to Beyond Disruption, where you'll learn how emerging tech is changing the world of accounting, business, and finance. Our guest experts break down the latest news in everything from blockchain to robotics, artificial intelligence to human intelligence. Tune in to find out how you can stay ahead of the curve.
Hello, welcome to the Go Beyond Disruption podcast, where we share insights on emerging technology, human intelligence, and digital transformation. Every week, AICPA and CIMA shares these exclusive perspectives from inside the accounting and finance profession that help you stay ahead of the curve. From our office in the heart of the City of London, I'm Kyle Hannan. In this episode, Beyond Maslow, we find out what really motivates today's professionals and tomorrow's leaders. And we'll be doing that with leadership and motivational expert Sophie Bennett. And just in case you're reaching for your pen and paper right now, or whatever app you use, you can find links and more information in our show notes, which you can view inside your podcast app, or by going to gobeyonddisruption.com, so you don't have to work too hard at the moment. All you have to do is sit back and listen. So let's get started with this week's conversation. Hello, Sophie. Where are you speaking from today?
Hello, Kyle. I'm speaking from a very windy and sunny and can't make its mind up weather day in Gloucestershire in England.
Well, you are in the west of the country. We're in the east. This interview is being recorded toward the end of summer 2019. So it's very likely if in a couple of years' time people are discovering this as an archive, that gives them a sense of when we were having this original conversation. So thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today. Sophie, let's start with you. All right, because there's quite a lot we can be saying about you, so I'll try and make a start. I did say you were a motivation expert, you're a best-selling author, you're a champion dressage rider with a strong business background. You're a visiting lecturer at the Cranfield School of Management, a Grand Prix dressage rider, as we've mentioned, a former national equestrian champion, a ski instructor, a best-selling author, and you were head of content for Dell. So certainly an eclectic background which guarantees presentations and your ability to talk to audiences and pack those presentations with anecdotes and interesting stories about leadership and motivation. You've been researching what drives successful people for the last 20 years. Then you've turned that into several books, including your latest, which we'll be talking about. It's called Find Your Flame, Why Motivation Matters More Than Talent. And while you interviewed people for the book, which I understand was almost 50 world-class performers from business, science, the arts and sport, it turns out you identified 5 new intrinsic motivation types that reveal how ordinary people tap into their deepest internal motivations to achieve amazing things. So you'll give us the inside track on what you've discovered about why these existing and future leaders do what they do. And you've also got some ideas and tools that we can all use to reach our full potential in a changing business environment. So that gives us some new understandings of what really drives people. You'll tell us about origin stories and this really interesting idea you have about creating what you call moments, those little steps that build toward a career ladder. And then we'll discover how we can create those moments and make those moments land so they really make a difference in our businesses and in our careers. So we've said quite a lot about you and your work already. So what have I left out? What else are you working on and how does it connect with our topic today?
Oh, well, I'm working on the next book, which is a little mini version that's almost like a desk version that people can keep in their top drawer and pull out when they're struggling with something. So that's the next little project, and that's going to be supporting some of the work I'm doing with Cranfield School of Management. And I hope to be able to leave that on seats in conferences as well, because as you've already mentioned, my primary job these days is a keynote speaker. So I think it's really helpful when you're doing conferences and speeches to be able to leave something behind that people can pick up and use afterwards and take back to the real world, non-conference world of busy lives and lots of things to do. Because otherwise you can be very inspired in a speech, but if you've got nothing to take away with you, then you can just go back to business as usual. And my job is to try and stimulate change and then give people the tools to be able to sustain it.
That sustaining question is something that I think marks leaders out from those of us who have yet to lead. It's resilience. It's being able to be consistent. It's the ability to keep going. And you've discovered that our understanding of what keeps us going, what motivates us, is developing all the time, and your core expertise is new understanding of what motivates us. So give us an idea of what sectors you focus on, what types of clients do you mainly work with, and what challenges or opportunities do you typically help them plot new paths through?
Okay, so my audience is really diverse. So in the last, say, 8 weeks, I've spoken to a group of health professionals. I've spoken to a large group of people who are dealing with terminally ill patients. I've spoken at an accountancy organisation, annual conference. So it's really diverse. People tend to book me because they have professional organisations. I have a professional background myself in consulting, as you mentioned, Dell. I've done a lot of IT consulting. So I think people realise that I understand professional audiences. And it's true that if you've been in a profession yourself, then you have an idea that you're already talking to highly qualified, highly intelligent people who are looking for something different, something new, and insights into their own performance. I'm not there to teach, and I think that's a difference as well. If you're going into a conference or a speaking engagement, and an element of it's teaching, then it's a different feel, isn't it? So dealing with professional audiences, it's understanding just how educated they already are and finding something that's going to be a perfect fit for them.
This is an increasingly global reality. So this is bound to have a universal relevance. And I think no matter where anyone may have gone to business school or done any business education, they may have run into the name that inspired the topic we're talking about, the title of this podcast, which is Beyond Maslow, what really motivates professionals and tomorrow's leaders. Remind us who Maslow is. Why did you choose that title? And what do you think it says about why this topic is so important right now?
Interesting with Ivan Maslow, who was a psychologist, and he came up with a pyramid of a hierarchy of needs back in I believe it was late 20s. And it's something that's really endured with people. Once our basic needs are met, we start getting increasingly sophisticated needs until at the end we come to self-actualization, which is on the top of the pyramid. Now, it's a great theory and it holds water in many areas of our life. And certainly it's true that as we age and as we develop and round out as people, our basic needs are likely to be increasingly met. And we start looking upwards to purpose-driven existences, to contributing to others. So Maslow is a very strong and well understood theory. However, I do think that there's something missing about it for today's professional world, and that is, how do you actually apply what Maslow tells us that helps us rise towards the top of the pyramid and live more satisfied lives? So when I started writing the book that's out now, the Find Your Flame book that you mentioned, I wanted to look at some real stories, some of the latest scientific evidence about the psychology of peak performance, and how we could take Maslow's great concepts and put some tools around them that people could actually use in their day-to-day lives. And I think with any research project, which is what a book is when it takes 2 years to write almost full time, is you very easily trip over little pieces of little nuggets of gold that you think, oh, that's interesting. I didn't expect to find that out. And that's sort of where the interest and the thread starts. And that's exactly what happened with my book. And that's where those 5 flames of motivation, those 5 intrinsic motivation types, that's where they came from one of those little, it's almost like pulling a little thread. And then you start to unravel what had gone before and realize there's a whole new world that's happened as a result of the technology changes that we have.
We always think we understand why we're motivated. And let's just go back to Maslow. For someone who's not looked at that hierarchy of needs, and I remember I've done this any number of times at various business schools, remind us what the old understanding of those standard ideas of motivations are. What else is on that hierarchy?
Yeah, so once you get your basic needs taken care of, then we don't sit back as humans and say, okay, that's it, we're done. We tend to look up and say, okay, how can we make life better? So it's natural that we're all trying to make life better. So once we've had our basic needs taken care of, then we start looking at more sophisticated needs. So it goes beyond food and shelter. It goes towards comfort. And then we start looking at our social needs and our creative needs and so on, until you get right up to a point of sort of almost Zen-like bliss, where you know exactly why you're on the planet, you have everything you need, all the internal resources. But until you've got the basics in place, if you haven't got a roof over your head and you can't eat and you can't provide for your family, then that's the total focus. But once you get beyond that, then you start looking at more and more sophisticated requirements.
And that's where your recent book, Find Your Flame, steps into the game, doesn't it? Because you've discovered that there's quite a lot beyond that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which many of us may already have run into. Quite a lot of new stuff that you've discovered. And tell us how you did that. Who did you talk to?
Yeah.
What actually came out in those conversations?
Okay, so one of the first things I did was I looked at all the modern work that had been done around motivation. So there's some great books on the topic which had already piled through hundreds of scientific papers, which I used as reference material, and I went back to the scientific papers to see if anything had been missed, because the best of all the books summarise so that a wider audience can get access to the material. So one of the key books I looked at was Drive by Daniel Pink, which is effectively a study of studies. And I love the way Daniel Pink writes. He's a real storyteller as well as a distributor of scientific discovery. And Pink was very good at defining the three elements that sort of rose, if you like, out of the bulk of the more recent scientific studies. And they were that although people are motivated in one way, businesses don't always match those natural motivations. And his mission was to try and get businesses to do what people really are looking for. And his three key motivators were mastery, which is becoming really good at something. And it's something that probably everybody listening to this podcast who's highly qualified professional will already understand, because mastery is about gaining your qualifications, knowing your craft, and becoming better and better at what you do. The second thing that he identified as a key motivator was a sense of autonomy, where you choose what you do, how you do it, and preferably who you do it with. So you choose your team, you choose your company. And thirdly, it's about having a sense of purpose, was the third leg of his three-legged stool. So if people have got a sense of mastery, a clear sense of purpose, and a feeling of autonomy, they will perform at their best. However, when I was reading that book, amongst many others, there was just a little feeling that there was something missing. Because I don't know about you, Kyle, but I don't get up in the morning thinking, I need more autonomy. You know, if you haven't got it, you know, if you're being micromanaged, and I'm sure most people, almost anybody listening to this has had somebody at some point micromanage them. It's really irritating, isn't it? But I knew that most people, once they have autonomy, once they have a sense of purpose, once they have a level of mastery, people don't stop being ambitious, do they? There's still a drive there. So I felt there was something missing. And that's when I started interviewing people, because I thought I need to get out into the field and talk to people who are exceptional at what they do to find out they've probably already got the mastery, they've already got autonomy, they've already got a clear sense of purpose. What is it that really drives them? Now they've got everything that they need to have. So a good chunk of the people I studied were in their 40s, 50s and beyond. They'd already reached a high level of success, and they were still highly driven people. So I interviewed artists, I interviewed CEOs, I interviewed scientists and sports people, and highly successful salespeople and speakers. So right across the professional and artistic spectrum. And what really shocked me was that nearly every single one of them, when I asked them, when they were first aware of how driven they were, they told me an origin story.
Now, that's something that I am really interested in, and I will ask you about origin stories in a little more detail later, but I'd be interested to know, how do you manage to track down and find 50 top business leaders who are willing to actually go that deep? Because I would imagine for many of them, they thought, well, this is going to be another discussion about Maslow. But you went to some new places. How did you take all of that and then put it into something that A, got them talking, and B, that you could then distill into something that makes something at that level relevant to those of us who may be on so many other different levels of our own career ladders?
Well, first of all, if I'd known how difficult it was going to be, I don't think I would have picked 50 people. And if I ever suggest I'm going to do another book based on 50 interviews plus a lot of research, please tie my hands behind my back and lock me in a darkened room, because it takes a lot to sort that amount of data out. Anyway, having done that, I was very fortunate to having had a sporting background and a business background. I was able to draw on a lot of amazing people who were in my contact base. And the people who weren't that I wanted to reach, often I simply just LinkedIn connected with them and asked them. And I was amazed how many people said, yeah, sure, I'll have an interview, provided you give me a clear background of what you're trying to achieve with the book. So I sent over a synopsis of what I was trying to achieve. I told them who the other participants were. And then crucially, I gave them a list of sample questions, which allowed people to judge if they were comfortable to do the interview or not. And it was the sample questions that actually led to the discovery, Kyle, because unwittingly, I asked a question that got people to really think about when that drive first kicked in for them.
Right. You changed the discussion about motivation, and you got some interesting responses, which you've put into your book. And that reminds us that things are always changing. So let's go back a bit before we go forward to what you've discovered in your book about motivation, what drives leaders. In the context of the work that you were doing in the past, perhaps when you were head of content at Dell, perhaps elsewhere, what was the last big disruption that you saw in the work you were doing, perhaps in your partnering with finance or accounting organizations? How did that change the organizations that you may have worked with in the past? What was the last big disruption?
There's a couple of big ones that I can refer to. The first real one that changed life completely was the internet disruption. And we are so used to email and podcasts and digital that now we forget that it actually wasn't that long ago when we didn't have all this digital technology and our working lives have changed enormously. So when I look back to 1998, I was working in a little boutique consultancy that specialised in information design. And nobody really knew what that was, but we used to write a lot of manuals and process stuff for banks and finance houses and procedures and things like that. But what we had was a way of making information and thinking modular. So right at that period when I was massively disrupted myself, by the way, because I was an ex-sports person coming into business. I didn't have a clue really what I was doing. But around that time, the world was being disrupted by this thing called the internet. And I remember going back from work one day and saying, hey, we need to get Google. And everybody in the bar where I was eating that night, turning around to me and said, Google? What's that? Now that's hard to imagine, Kyle, isn't it? But actually, it was only 20 years ago. And now Google completely dominates our lives. So I happen to be, I suppose, in the right place at the right time, in that I was a beginner in computing when everybody was a beginner in computing. So I've never lost that sense of amazement and wonder at what it does. And I've never lost the feeling that the velocity is always faster than we expect it to be. You know, we think we're in a world that's relatively stable because we don't notice how quickly it's changing around us until we're hit by a personal, huge disruption. And having listened to some of your previous podcasts, something that it always seems to amaze people that the disruption actually hits them at some point. And the big thirst I have from audiences is how can I personally prepare myself for disruption? But what people really want to know is how they can avoid it. And that's the challenge, because the most successful people on a long-term basis that I speak to, and I'm very fortunate I get to speak because of my job to a lot of very successful people in fast changing industries, is they are not the people who are trying to avoid disruption. They're either the people who are making it or the people who are designing how other people can ride it. So they get well ahead of the curve. They're not fearful of disruption. They're actually party to it, or they are the big disruptors. And that's how they ensure themselves against a future-proof their own careers, if you like.
Let's keep that momentum going by bringing it back to those very people that you've written about in your book. What were the different motivation types that you write about? What did you discover about what actually drives these business leaders that you interviewed?
We put all this complex psychological language around motivation. We talk about employee engagement as if it's a thing. And yes, it can be measured and we can find out how our employees are feeling about our companies and their jobs. But ultimately, we are feeling creatures. And what I realized from the interviews was that when you ask somebody a very specific question about when they first felt something, it's almost as if the years drop away as they remember it. Now, what I realized was after doing the 50 interviews, I thought I was onto something. So I did a survey of another 400 people, and the results made it crystal clear to me that people have certain feelings that they gravitate towards, and they spend their lives trying to reproduce them as often as possible and as strongly as possible. So the motivations that people have sort of fell into roughly 5 categories.
So get us started. So there were these 5 essential elements that you put in that book.
Yes.
Were they all a surprise to you?
A couple of them were a surprise to me. And as we go through them, I think if you're listening to this podcast, you'll recognize some of them yourself. Some of them you will be surprised at, and some of them are obvious, but only when you know that they exist. So the first one is a flow motivation, and people that experience a state of flow, like a Zen state of being in the zone state fairly early on in life, are looking for more of it. Because flow is really powerful. It has powerful neurotransmitters. It has a biochemistry of its own, and it feels great, but it's quite a solitary experience. So if you've ever been totally absorbed in a computer game, or you've been out sailing and feel at one with the sea, or you ski or run in the countryside and, you have that feeling of the wind in your hair and all your worries drop away, that's a feeling of flow. And it's been identified. You can read all about the science behind flow. There was an author called Mihai Csikszentmihalyi who wrote the definitive book on flow. So flow was a state that when people experience it, they want more and more of it. Incidentally, not everybody has experienced flow. So you are motivated by it strongly if you have felt it. So that's the first one. The second one was people who get a great feeling from being part of a team, and it's inclusion motivation. So these are people who have a strong bond with others, who get their biggest high from seeing a group perform well. And in the interviews, these were often people who came either from very strong families or who had strong team experiences when they were young, where they really felt at their most alive when they were part of a functioning group. So in some ways it's opposite to flow, because it's about other interaction with others where you get the buzz from, as opposed to flow, which is very personal and very internal. You can be in flow, but not anybody else can necessarily see it. By the way, as a listener, you can follow along with the 5 types because it spells fired as in fired up. So we've got flow, we've got inclusion. The third one is results motivation, and people that told me about their one of their strongest memories being winning something, achieving something. And for one gentleman, for example, it was when he was recognised by his dad for the first time for really achieving something. And he said to me that his father really hadn't paid much attention to him. He felt invisible until he was about 7, and he won a prize at school, and his dad literally gave him a pat on the back and for the first time ever said he was proud of him. And interestingly, that person went on to become an award-winning athlete, because he knows that winning stuff gets the attention and gets him the recognition that he seeks. And results motivation can come out in all sorts of ways. So some academics are very driven by results motivation as well. That's results. The fourth one, completely different, and it's expression motivation. And that's really all about emotions and your artistic side. And people who are very results motivated often can't relate to this so well. But people who are very strongly expression motivated are looking for peaks of feeling. So you often see this with people in the arts, in caring professions, people who write poetry. And there's actually thousands upon thousands of expression-driven people hidden, and I use the word very deliberately, hidden inside the world of business and commerce, because it's not always looked on terribly well. It's not looked on as a strength. And yet if you ask people what they do at weekends, and they say to you that they do medieval reenactments, or they write poetry, or they're part of a choir, or they secretly want to be the next pop star or songwriter, then chances are you've got an expression-driven person in your midst. And they have a really strong need to communicate. So if expression-driven people are suppressed and they don't have a voice, they can actually have a negative effect on culture. So I have to say, all of the 5, we've only got one more to go, all of the 5 have shadows, of course. So that's not that expression-driven people have a shadow and the rest don't. Every motivation type has a shadow. And the final one, I'll tell you a story actually, rather than tell you what it is straight off. The final one, if you've got this, you'll have an insatiable appetite for new things. A scientist called Professor Norman MacLeod, when I asked him that question when he was first motivated, he said he was about 9 years old and he remembers in his garden in Texas picking up a rock and turning this rock over and seeing all this stuff wriggling underneath. And they were ants and termites. And he said he looked at this rock and he just went, wow. And he said, for the last 60 years, I've been doing that pretty much ever since. He's still as fascinated now about discovering new things. So the final flame, the final motivating factor is discovery. And anybody who's watched people like Professor Brian Cox or David Attenborough on TV will relate to that eternal fascination, and that one question, merely by answering it, you merely open up another few questions. And those people, for example, make brilliant forensic accountants, brilliant trial lawyers who want to get to the truth, great detectives, brilliant scientists. So that sense of discovery, it can be a bit of grit in the oyster because they always want to know the next thing. They're never satisfied with what they know. Not always the easiest people to work with in every sense, but they are hugely innovative. And without them, our businesses would stall and grind to a halt because we'd all get too comfortable.
So let's see if I've got this right. There's flow, there's inclusion, results, expression, and discovery, all of which, if you make a word out of that abbreviation, gives you the word fired.
Correct.
Give us an example of what this new understanding means practically.
I'm going to split my answer into 2 parts. And the first part is that with these states, they are states, not traits. This is not personality. It's about feelings, right? So they are states of being. Once we have identified what it is that really drives us, whether that be flow, inclusion, results, expression or discovery, we will want to reproduce those states and get them as often as possible and as strongly as possible for ourselves. But what we don't realise is that because we've spent a lifetime doing that or getting closer to that feeling more of the time, we'll have developed the skills around it. Now, here's what I mean. For example, if you are good at getting into flow because that's your preferred state, you will have a whole bunch of skills that people without that aren't chasing that particular state, that particular flame, don't have. So people who are good at getting into flow are brilliantly focused. They are great at excluding distraction, being in the moment, being focused. It's the skill of mastery. They're good at getting masterful at something. And you'll often find flow people very highly skilled at multiple different things. And it's because they have the meta skill of applying themselves, of focusing things, the focusing on something really deeply. Now, inclusion people are really great at making human connection, but they're not necessarily great at focusing. So the point is that every one of these states has a really powerful skill behind it. So in the real world, when you can identify the state that's most preferable to you, you will realise that you have skills that are transferable elsewhere that you may not have thought about as skills. If I asked a flow-driven person if they thought that concentration was a skill, and I have done, and they just look at me sideways, they almost don't understand the question because it's so natural to them. And yet, if you ask them how good they are at building rapport with people, they'll often then start to twitch and be a little bit uncomfortable. If you ask an inclusion person how good they are at building rapport with people, they'll look at you as if you're nuts because they think everybody can do it. Yeah, so there's things that we get good at, that we become more skillful at, that become just part of who we are. But one of the brilliant things a leader can do with this is that they can identify, almost use it as a map for the key skills in the team. So focus people, brilliant. Flow people, brilliant at getting focused. Inclusion people, brilliant at building teams, bringing people together, building rapport, negotiating, anything where they have to start bringing people together. Results people are fantastic at being self-accountable, but not everybody's self-accountable. Some people find the glare of have you reached a deadline? Have you succeeded? Have you itemized your success? Some people find that very stressful. Now, what results people are fabulous at is reframing so-called failure, as other people may see it, into a learning opportunity. So they use not doing something well as more information to reach the next result. So reframing failure is something they do quite naturally. And you hear this a lot from sports people, actually. You'll say, why didn't you win the medal? And they won't say, because I had a bad day. They'll say, well, I got my training regime wrong and I didn't peak at the right moment, and I don't think my nutrition was right. We need to go back and have another look at that. So they take what many people call failure just as data, as information. It's very dispassionate, that source of information. So, and that's a skill. Very few people I've ever spoken to realise that reframing failure is a skill. They think it's a gift. They think somehow that these results-driven people are just magically more resilient than they are. No, they just have a different strategy for how they cope with failure. Because failure isn't failure. They've reframed it. They've repackaged it in their minds to be something that's not to be taken personally, that's an information goldmine about how they can do things differently and succeed next time. And if you ask a results-driven person that, they won't see it as a skill. They think that everybody can do it. If you ask expression-driven people about how good they are at empathising, again, they'll look at you and think, well, everybody can do that, can't they? Because to them, it's not a skill, but they have a certain way of doing things, a certain process that allows them to put themselves in other people's shoes and to connect with their own emotions and connect with the emotions of others. To them, it's not a skill. And for discovery-driven people, they don't think that curiosity is a skill. But it is. There's a certain pattern of thinking that allows people to ask more questions. So people who aren't very creative or innovative in a business, for example, if you sat them down with somebody who's very creative, very innovative, who's discovery-driven, initially there would probably be conflict because the discovery person wants to unpick everything, wants to discover how it all works. But if you actually were able to take their mindset and say, okay, how can you get somebody excited about change? A discovery person can show people how to do that when they're put in the right environment. So on a practical level, it's very helpful to just understand that each of the motivators has developed into a skill set. And to get a rounded team or a rounded board, you actually need them all. You need somebody who can focus. You need somebody who can bring a team together. You need somebody who can deliver the results. You need somebody who can create the culture and keep people on board and communicate, which is what expression-driven people are brilliant at doing. They're great communicators. And you need somebody to innovate, because otherwise, whatever you're doing now is only going to be successful for a limited amount of time before your competition outperforms you or the market or the world around you changes and makes you less relevant. So it's a really great little postcard, 5 key things that you need to be aware of is working in your team or in your company right now. Are we innovative enough? Are we focused enough? Are we people focused enough? Are we results focused enough? And are we connecting emotionally with our team or with our customers? So that's part one of the answer. The other part of the answer, I said I was going to answer in 2 parts, was actually the 5 flames are really all about moments that made such an impact on people that they've spent their lives in some way trying to reproduce that great feeling. So our customers and our teams, our clients, remember the moments of impact we make on them. Most of what we do disappears in a blur with people because people have got busy lives, right? So if you look at work from the Heath brothers, huge fan of the Heath brothers. I think their website is just heathbrothers.com. 2 professors based in the US who write about psychology and peak performance. They wrote a book a little while ago called The Power of Moments, and they define the most powerful moments and the ones that we remember as the first moments that we experience something, the last moments that we experience in a particular context, and the peaks, the high points and the pits. So we remember the best and the worst and the beginning and the end. And everything in the middle tends to sort of disappear into our forgettable consciousness. So if we can create peak moments for people, whether that be for our clients, whether it be for the members of our organizations that we're running, if we're running an organization like AICPA, CIMA, where we have hundreds of thousands of members across the world, how can we create experiences, moments for them that will make a personal impact on them? And so the flames allow you, those 5 motivation types, allow you to design different experiences for people who are motivated in different ways.
So am I getting this right? With a leader having this greater understanding of themselves, they're then moving towards a better understanding of their immediate team, and that sits down through the organization, everyone relaxing into a better version of themselves, but specifically from the top down, which makes it very important because you're reducing stress. And as people become this more aware, better versions of the professional selves that they are, you will find leaders moving from people who just have the leadership position. They're starting to exercise more influence in a better way as well. And that leads them to have more personal as well as professional impact. And as a result, the team works better and the organization works better. So have I got that right?
Absolutely spot on. Absolutely spot on. Because once people move from authority to impact, instead of using their authority to influence people, they use their leadership, that personal quality of inner self-confidence, of certainty, of being outward looking. People will naturally start to follow rather than just defer to authority. And that's when people's personal power, whatever level of the organisation you are in, or maybe you're self-employed and you're a member and you want to more influence and impact with your clients. That sense of self, exploring self and understanding your context in the world, that's what moves you from authority to influence. It's a huge shift.
And you can be many of these 5 different elements, can't you? You can have more than one flame burning.
Absolutely. Well, I think we all have all of them. But what I have identified is that we all have one really bright one that we gravitate to first. And then we have a secondary one which balances it out. And a smattering of the other 3. And it's contextual, of course. It may be that you seek flow in your personal life because skiing is your big thing, which is a very flow-driven activity. But when you're at work, you're a highly results-driven person and you love the numbers and you love reaching targets. So, yeah, we have different flames in different contexts. But there's one, I think as a listener, you'll probably have recognised something about yourself in each of those that really stood out to you. And then people tell me they hear another one and think, oh, am I that one or that one? But yeah, one big strong one secondary one, and a smattering of the other 3 in context.
Right, certainly lots to talk about as we continue our conversation with Sophie shortly. We'll be talking about some practical steps to turn disruption into opportunity. We'll especially go back to that idea of origin stories, the turning over of the rocks in our own histories. Also more about the moments that we'll be creating as steps on career ladders and ways of making those moments land so they have real impact. All of that is coming up in this episode of the Go Beyond Disruption podcast, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. You can find out more about this podcast and about the rest of what we do at gobeyonddisruption.com. We are talking to Sophie Bennett about what really motivates today's leaders and what that new understanding tells us about what we can do to maximize our own leadership potential in a changing and transforming business environment. Sophie, you mentioned the importance of origin stories. Now, this has nothing to do with X-Men, but I would imagine that you can give us an idea of what these stories actually are, right? Is it true that what made us who we were will always make us who we'll be?
I think one of the wonderful things about being human is that we can choose who we want to be at any point in life. However, we are all influenced by our past because we are a product of all the things that we've experienced and seen and that have happened to us. Some things have been hugely positively motivational, and other things will be things that we want to avoid, and pain and discomfort and disappointment. Many people spend their lives avoiding that. So I remember one of the people I interviewed for the book, for example, who said to me that we spend a big chunk of our time avoiding all the pain we had when we were younger by excelling. And a lot of high achievers are actually just in the business of avoiding disappointment and pain. And I thought, well, that's a really negative way to think about it. And then when I looked back through the transcripts, I realised to a large extent he was right. So yes, we're a product of our past, but our future is anything we want to make it. The origin story idea is really important because even if those experiences haven't shaped us as much as we think, it's the carrying on telling ourselves that that's who we are that sort of can lock us in and prevent us from going forward.
Right, I have to ask this now. I mentioned right in the beginning that you were a dressage rider, you were a champion equestrian. Now, people might be expecting me to ask, what is dressage? They can Google it, because now Google exists. We've definitely established that. But what we've not established is where it all started for you. What's your origin story?
Well, I remember starting life when I was very, very small, dreaming about little white ponies coming out of the walls at bedtime and carting me away to sleep. So I always had this obsession with horses. And I was a very nervous horse rider. So it goes back to this origin story, really. And I think one of the reasons I've ended up as a very flow motivated person is that because I was nervous, I never felt that comfortable on a pony. I was always scared it was going to run away with me or buck me off and chuck me on the floor and kick me. So I knew the only way to insulate against that was to become a really good rider. So I never felt gifted as a rider, but I always worked very, very hard. And the lessons that taught me were that if you really apply yourself to something, if you really master something, as much as any individual balance-based sport can be mastered, I suppose, it became a habit of excellence, because I achieved, in common with many of the people I interviewed in the book, much greater success than I ever expected to. Remember, there was one lady I spoke to, a lady called Judy Narker, and Judy sold her company for about £60 million, so it was about $75 million at the time, to a huge global company. And she said, I never expected it to happen. I was just trying to pay the mortgage. But she was not a perfectionist, but she was certainly a high achiever. So she drove herself to be the best that she could be, and the company just grew and grew and grew. And so a lot of people who have achieved great things, they almost feel like it's a bit of an accident. But they found a key to success for them was just becoming really, really good at things. So my origin story, if you like, taught me very early on that if I apply myself, if I master things, I get unexpected rewards, and it always takes me to surprising places. And that's played out in my life. You know, I've reinvented myself, as some of your listeners may be doing right now. They're reinventing their careers, reinventing their place within the world of finance, reevaluating their own lives entirely. And it's important to know that the skills that have got you the success you've got so far can be reapplied in a different context. That's a very comforting thing to know. So my origin story definitely goes back to apply yourself, master something, and then the confidence that comes with it opens just amazing doors. Because self-confidence really is the key to success, isn't it? I think without self-confidence, if you're telling yourself these stories that you can't do things, that you're limited, that you don't know enough people, that you're not good enough to do this, life has a habit of becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. So confidence comes from competence, I think, in the world for many, many people.
I faced a very similar situation to you when I was on a pony and I fell off, and I remember sky and then ground and then sky. The only thing that was constant were my feet rolling head over heels, coming to a stop, completely winded. You would have got on to that horse again and kept riding until you mastered it. The way I approached the situation was never to get on a horse again. So perhaps I need to recalibrate. So that was my practical solution. So let's keep it practical.
Well, maybe you're the sensible one, Kyle.
Well, it's not the moment of landing that I think we were talking about, because I know you did talk about making and landing moments that matter. For me, that impact bruised. But I've got beyond it. But for someone who's working now in a data intensive or a numbers first team environment in the professional finance capacity or in accounting, what are some things a leader or a future leader can do to really start making a difference?
I think the biggest thing is human connection. And the more we go into an AI-driven world, the more we experience remote working, the more we have the autonomy that we all dream of, the more isolated we can become. You know, people sit behind email and social media, and it's very easy to do because it's very non-threatening. We've got a chance to think our words through before they actually, you know, appear on a screen somewhere. So for anybody building a career, whether it be looking for your next job, whether it be stepping up into a leadership position, whether it's just becoming better at what you do right now and become the best that you can be, you can't do it in a vacuum. And the biggest lesson I am learning from all the amazing people I get to speak with and listen to is that the ones that get on are the ones that have a great network, the ones who work on their personal and social skills, the ones who overcome introversion enough to make the connections that are important to them. Because I recognise in finance there's a lot of introverts. Personally, I'm an introvert. People expect all speakers, I think, to be naturally extroverts. But actually, when you're up on stage there, you're up there alone, you know. So introversion is something that does block a lot of careers, I believe. And when you realise that some very successful people are highly introverts, it actually opens the door for other introverts to realise that they can be a success. So, yeah, the big lesson at the moment, the big relevant leadership skill right now, the big career building skill right now is the same as it's always been, which is build your personal connections, work on your soft skills, and build those human relationships, because people always go to people they know first for anything before they'll go to a stranger.
So when you talk about creating these moments as steps on our own career ladder and then making sure they land in the right way, you talk about it's got to feel right, so it's got to land in the right way for ourselves. It's got to land in the right way with the people we work alongside, but it's also got to make sense in terms of our own career ladder. So when you're already on the way up, how do you take something that might feel good personally, but then you think, right, that now has to reflect out. I've now got to engage a team of managers or an entire department to do this, to think about themselves from their own perspectives as individuals. How do you do that? And then how would you expect that to impact their performance and their business once that starts to land properly?
Well, first of all, these moments are usually moments of connection or moments of insight. They're moments of impact that they're the times that people remember. So people will often remember their first day in a job or their first day in a new team. They'll remember moments of peak stress. So maybe they have to speak in front of their team for the first time. That's often very stressful for people. So firsts, lasts, peaks and troughs. We talked about that early on. The higher we go up the chain of leadership, the more people need to spend time designing those moments rather than allowing them to unfold by accident. So let me give you a great example. When we move from one project to another, which happens all the time in business, and we're all undergoing change programs nearly all of the time. One of the hard things people struggle with often is letting go of work that they've done previously. It's very hard to have spent time on a project or in a team and then suddenly find that project is no more. So there's an emotional withdrawal from that. There was a great example. Steve Jobs famously, or actually not so famously, because this particular story about Jobs isn't so well known, but it's a brilliant concept. Jobs knew how to help people let go of the past so that they could face in a new direction. And when they retired on one of their old faithful operating systems, it was a Mac operating system, they'd had about 2,000 engineers who had worked on this project, who'd missed their school kids' nativity plays, who'd missed holidays, who'd worked nights and missed their favourite football team playing, who'd left their wives in the delivery room. I'm serious. So he knew that when they retired that project, a lot of people were going to feel a sense of loss. And there was a bit of anger inside the company that they were actually culling this particular OS. So here's what Steve Jobs did. And this to me is brilliant leadership. He held a mock funeral on the stage on the Apple campus. So everybody could pay their respects to all the work that had gone into the operating system and gave thanks for its existence and what it had contributed to the company. And now it was time to bring in the new blood. So he almost allowed everybody to grieve and showed that the work and the dedication that the engineers had put into that operating system was not just going to disappear and just get written off. And yet so many times in our businesses, we finish something and then we just almost sweep it under the carpet and we go next. And it can be soul destroying for people. So when I talk about designing moments, I believe it's up to leaders to design those moments of transition with great care. And if that sounds like too big a deal for busy people to do, if you just take a moment to have a conversation with somebody who doesn't maybe think that you like them very much, which is totally untrue because you're just a busy person, you could potentially make a moment that that person will remember for months, if not years. If you smile at somebody who's looking a bit depressed in the corner, it's very, very easy to just walk past them. But really smile and connect with somebody, it will make a moment for them that could lift the rest of their day. So making moments isn't complicated, but the most powerful ones are made from personal connections and thinking about the impact that the work has on your team and on the people in your business closest to you. Because they're the ones you have the biggest impact on, right? Whether you're a leader or a manager or you're a sole practitioner within a team, the people who work closest to you, they feel your energy on a daily basis. So it's up to us to try and impact other people as best we can with an energy that's going to enhance their day, not just ours.
Impact and energy are really important. And those, I would imagine, are qualities that you bring to some of the presentations you make. You did say that when you're on stage, you're always standing there by yourself. But of course, you're facing an audience of many, many people. And you've often said that the accounting and finance professionals that you've spoken to in the past seem to have found your presentations really beneficial. So where have you been speaking recently? And what have people told you about what they've learned from these sessions?
So a few weeks ago, I was in the beautiful island of Jersey for the ACCA regional conference. I had about 200 finance professionals in there. And what really resonated with them, people told me about afterwards, was that something I tend to do in my presentations, I don't just chalk and talk, as they say. I want people to interact, if only mentally. You know, if the room's, if it's inappropriate to get 500 people standing up and doing an exercise, which it often is in a big conference, that just, you lose control of the room, you lose control of the timing, so that doesn't always work. But you can ask people searching questions, because when people are in an audience, in a conference, they are getting time to reflect that they very, very rarely do at work. You know, we're all very productivity driven. We've all got a lot to do. So when somebody's sitting there for a 45-minute keynote, after about 10 minutes, we naturally zone out. Our brains are, if we listen to the same voice for a long period of time, we naturally start to lose attention and we go off and we daydream a little bit. So my presentations are always very interactive. I'm asking people to just make a note on their phone about something or rate themselves from 1 to 10, or they don't have to share the outcomes of those results. But depending on the audience, I will design an experience for them for 45 minutes rather than talk through a speech. And I think that's very different. And people will come out and they'll say things to me like, I didn't know that about myself. I'm going to try something different at the office tomorrow. Or I'd never thought about reframing failure is one that comes up time and time again when I talk about results drive and how results driven people are very good at reframing failure. And people often say to me, I just think I've failed. You've made me think differently about that. So my job, I think, is to help people rethink their own perceptions, maybe rethink their origin stories, and have 45 minutes of time for themselves that can have a real impact on the way they do things when they come out of that conference room. That's my job. And if I get people that comment on LinkedIn or send me an email or come up to me afterwards, then, which they always do, and I'm always blown over by some of the changes, the profound changes that happen to some people, then I know I've done my job that day.
Before I ask you what you've got coming up, I'm particularly interested in why you think finance or accounting professionals find this to be particularly interesting from the perspective of how the profession is changing or the challenges it faces at the moment as people look in so many directions for new opportunities, not absolutely certain which path to follow. When you speak to a finance audience, where do you think what you say particularly chimes with them?
Okay, well, people tell me there's a lot of fear around AI and automation, and that's quite understandable because things are going super, super fast. I did something at a talk at Accountex called Rise of the Robots a couple of months ago, and that was really looking into what's going on in the Far East and what's going on in China and Asia, because they are on a parallel universe to us in terms of AI and how they're applying AI to day-to-day business applications. So that's a source of great fear to people. Accountants and finance professionals often, not entirely, but often tend to be introvert. There's a high proportion of introversion in finance. So people aren't always comfortable expressing their fears and expressing their concerns. And a lot of the time people are nervous about saying that they have a question, that they don't know everything that they think they should know. But the biggest change of all is that for the last 100 years or more, we have been in a world that's respected qualifications above everything else. Certifications come very, very highly. Growing professional qualifications, growing professional stature has depended on passing exams. And so we have come from a point of measuring financial and professional competence. But we're in a changing world because with AI and automation and the new technologies that are coming along, our technical skills are actually the first ones that are going to be disrupted in a major way. So what's left when you take the technical skills away? In the main, people are very fearful about that, but I'm personally very optimistic about it because I think what gets left is the skills that we have to connect with our customers and clients, our amazing human ability to see exceptions from the rule. And although an algorithm can do that to a point, there's something about human intuition that means that we do it amazingly well in context. So I think for people who are have always been focused on technical excellence and technical skill, obviously, I'm not saying drop that. It's very important people are properly qualified for the job. But that's almost a starting point because that's the bit that's going to get disrupted first. So, yeah, it's again, back to this leadership, back to making connections, back to personal impact, back to personal connections. The circle always seems to come round and end up back in the same place, doesn't it?
Well, let's look at that cycle. And I did say we're recording this in late summer 2019. What's on your calendar? What's coming up for you over the course of the next few months? Where will you be speaking again?
Oh, well, I've got a pretty busy autumn coming up. I've got a lot of work coming up with the Cranfield School of Management. Some of that's going to be international. So I'm very excited around designing a course around the 5 flames and the design of moments for individuals, for teams, and for customer experiences. So that's something really exciting. I've also got speaking engagements for CPA Australia for their European conference. I'm speaking at the International Institute of Business Analysts. And for membership organisations, I've just been booked for the Association Executives Congress, which are membership organisations from accounting to publishing to healthcare. If people have lots of members with shared interests, then the chief executives or senior event planners are going to be at that event. So that I'm going to be talking there about designing moments for broader communities, which is a really exciting concept.
I think that's one of the things that we realize that today, as there's more and more technology making it easier for people to connect. You've got your LinkedIn groups, you've got, as you said, the professional associations, you've got Facebook and whatever other platforms may be coming to the fore in the future. It's important to get a sense of once you've attracted a community or professional association, a membership organization of any sort, how do you keep them together? How do you keep them motivated? How do you keep them engaged? So I think talking to membership associations and organizations, as you will be doing, I think will be very important, what motivates them too. So let's keep that audience in mind, because we know that our typical listener likes to keep ahead of the curve, very much like the same people you speak to. So help us out here from your perspective. What's the next disruption that you see coming?
I think it's going to be application of AI. At the moment, we've got AI it sits there at the back of LinkedIn helping us suggest our next conversations. It's driving some of the algorithms that affect our lives around insurance, all sorts of different financial decisions. But it's not really as widespread as it's going to be in 10 years' time. There's some really interesting stuff that's going on in China, where China, because they didn't have such an advanced financial infrastructure as many parts of the West, they didn't have credit cards as standard. They didn't have checks, albeit they're being phased out here now, but they don't have direct debit or standing orders or plastic debit cards. There was a whole host of missing infrastructure in China, which has, with the advent of AI, given them a huge advantage in that they have gone almost from cash to cashless without having to get rid of anything. So they haven't had to make a substantial mental leap from a direct debit with a guarantee to a QR code and money coming straight out of your bank account. So that's, for me, is one of the biggest ones that's coming for this profession specifically, is that we haven't really gone cashless yet. It's going to happen very, very quickly when it starts. And I don't think we'll know really what's hit us. And the next big disruption from that will be going straight from cashless transactions straight into our local tax authorities, whether that be the IRS in the US or HMRC in the UK or the equivalent in different countries. So I think there's going to be a huge industry-wide disruption around how and where finance professionals come into the mix, because there's going to be a lot more direct to consumer and business owner, direct to the tax authorities interaction. A lot of that's going to be driven by AI, and a lot of it's going to be driven by cashless transactions. So yeah, a lot of disruption coming, and the people that will cope with it will be the people with good leadership skills.
The software and the tech is going to be an opportunity, you say, because what that's going to do is take stuff off our desks as finance professionals. So now the opportunity is for us to figure out what other value can we bring. And what I'm also hearing you say is opportunity is out there. We've just got to make sure that we feel comfortable in ourselves in order to be really ready to surf that wave, whatever direction it's coming from.
Absolutely. And I think governing bodies and trade associations and professional membership organisations like AICPA and CIMA are doing a great job to pull together what's going on in the wider world. It's really, really important that people stay connected with the research and the information that you produce, because we can't take in everything from everywhere. You know, there's a limit. We're already all on information overload, but definitely it's never been more important to keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on out there in the wider world. It's changing really fast.
And stay connected with people if you're in a membership organization.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stay connected, use the opportunities, your peers as a resource, but also remember that you are a resource to others as well. Keep those connections going, make those moments, because they are coming from you as well as toward you. And that's important. So you did talk about not wanting to give too much information to people, but before we wrap up, I'm going to ask you to do some signposting. So we are going to need some more information. For anyone who would like to find out more about this topic in general, or about your work in particular, what are some resources you'd recommend?
Okay, so if anybody's interested in the 5 flames of motivation and their shadows, especially for this podcast, I'm going to produce a downloadable PDF. So that will be on the website by the time this gets out onto iTunes.
Yes, we'll also put those in our show notes as well. So anything that you hear Sophie talking about now, there'll be links in our show notes. Absolutely.
So, and I will, you're going to do a summary of the conversation in the show notes. So saves me doing that. And I'll put a link to any of the books that you've mentioned, and obviously a link to Find Your Flame, Why Motivation Matters More Than Talent. And if anybody wants a resource to talk to their teams or staff, then obviously I'm approachable for, to appear on podcasts or to come and talk to your organisation. So I think we've scratched the surface of a lot of things on this fantastic podcast. It's been really great fun to record. But to go narrow and deep on just one element of that can be of huge value.
So they can find you at sophiebennett.com. That's 2 N's and 2 T's.
Correct. Thank you.
And one last thing we need you to do, Sophie. What's an actionable suggestion, one last piece of advice you'd like to leave for accounting and finance professionals that help them to go beyond disruption?
Great question. Well, my answer to that is stay curious, because variety is the spice of life. We are going to get faced with all sorts of challenges. We're not going to see a lot of them coming around the corner, but they're going to land up on our doorstep anyway. And there's a lovely quote that I heard, and I heard it verbally, so I couldn't trace the source of it, but this is one well worth keeping in mind, which is that we are most comfortable when we are certain, but we're most alive when we're uncertain. So don't be afraid to reinvent yourself. Have the courage, stay curious, and do your best to see what's coming around the next corner, and then you can design your life to make the most of that opportunity.
Thank you, Sophie Bennett. A great place to end our conversation today about motivation. The show notes will include links to all the resources we've mentioned. There are 2 other websites we'd recommend for listeners interested in the latest courses, webinars, and professional development resources to keep you ahead of the curve about this and other topics, human intelligence and tech. You'll find those at AICPAstore.com/go-beyond-disruption or cgmastore.com/go-beyond-disruption. Go and have a look. Fees may apply for some of those, but you will find plenty of stuff to pique your interest. Thank you again to our guest, author and motivational expert Sophie Bennett. You may be seeing her speak at an accounting or finance professional symposium sometime in your country soon. But of course, we had her right here today. And thank you for listening to this podcast. From the heart of the City of London, from the AICPA and CIMA, I'm Kyle Hannan. We'll be back soon with more conversations that help you and your profession to go beyond disruption. Until next time, goodbye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Beyond Disruption, brought to you by the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants. Learn more about today's topic at AICPA-CIMA.com/disruption. This podcast is designed to provide illustrative information with respect to the subject matter covered and does not represent an official opinion or position of the Association of International Certified Professional Accountants or any of its subsidiaries or affiliates. It is provided with the understanding that the association, its affiliates, and subsidiaries are not engaged in rendering legal, accounting, or other professional services. If such advice or expert assistance is required, the services of a competent professional person should be sought. The association, its subsidiaries, and affiliates make no representations, warranties, or guarantees as to and assume no responsibility for the content or application of the material contained herein and expressly disclaim all liability for such damages arising out of the use of, reference to, or reliance on such material.